Welcome to a day of creationism from the Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, featuring Ken Ham with Answers in Genesis Ministries. And now the conference host, Dr. Jerry Falwell.
The Day of Creationism continues live from the Thomas Road Baptist Church, Lynchburg, Virginia, on the Liberty Channel. Our teacher, Ken Ham. This is lesson number 4. You've heard 3 lessons this morning live. And now in the 1 o'clock session, Eastern Time, Ken is speaking on one blood, the biblical answer to racism. Let's go into the session.
You know, in the last session, we used biblical history and applied it to dinosaurs, and then used science to show how the biblical glasses work and can be defended. On this session, we're going to apply it to the people groups all over the earth. For instance, in my homeland of Australia, the Australian Aborigines, when Captain Cook sailed up the east coast in 1770, met the Australian Aborigines. Well, who are they? Where'd they come from? Interestingly, as I said in one of the other sessions, before they met missionaries, they have stories that sound like Genesis 1 to 11. So the American Indians and the Fijians and so on. As we look over the world, we see all these different people groups. So how do we explain them? Well, again, there are different glasses people have on to look at that same evidence. If you believe the secular history that man evolved from some ape-like creature, and you look at the people groups, and you look through Darwinian eyes, so to speak, then Darwin taught that some people are closer to the ape-like ancestors than others. He taught, therefore, that there were different races of people. In fact, in his book, The Descent of Man, he particularly deals with man, and actually, sadly, had the Australian Aborigines basically back closest to the ape-like ancestor to man. In fact, very, very sad, but the Australian Aborigines were once considered the missing links in evolution. And that, as we'll see later on, had terrible consequences. Now, of course, if we take the biblical view is that all people are descendants of Adam and Eve, and then we have 8 people who survive on Noah's Ark, and then we have the event of the Tower of Babel. If we take that biblical view of history and we look through those biblical glasses, can we understand how you get, well, for instance, people say, what about all the different skin colors? Actually, there aren't any different skin colors, as we're going to show you. What about the eye shape? What about all the differences we see? Actually, the differences are extremely minor. One of the things we're going to learn in this session is that we've been programmed to see differences as major, when in fact they're very minor. Now, to do this, what I want to do is to do a little bit of revision in genetics. Remember we talked about genetics when we talked about natural selection, talked about dogs, talked about poodles. You know, one of the reasons I talk about poodles is to make genetics fun. That's why I like to talk about poodles, because otherwise it gets boring, right? And I just needed an example of something that was genetically inferior to be able to do that, and so I just happened to use a poodle. But anyway, you remember that we went through and looked at the fact if you start with 2 dogs and you get this large population of dogs, and we understand a little bit of basic genetics, this is very basic, of course, it's much more technical than this, much more complicated than this. By the way, I do want to say to you, even though it's much more technical, much more complicated than this, and all sorts of complicated exceptions and so on, nonetheless, the basic principles are the same, and anyone, even if you're not a scientist, can use the basic principles to teach this sort of information. But how we get dominant and recessive genes, big A, big B, little b, and so on. You can get all this different, these different combinations in the offspring, and so you get variations within the dog kind. We talked about how much information is there in our genes. Just to remind you, the number of atoms in the universe, about 10 to the 80th power. It's 1 followed by 80 zeros. The number of electrons you can fit into the known universe, something like 10 to the 130th power. But Francisco Ayala, a famous evolutionist from California, worked out the number of possible combinations from your genes, from just one man and one woman, without getting 2 the same, 10 to the 2017th power. By the way, there's something to aim for. Imagine that. It's zillions upon zillions upon zillions. And so I want to get across the incredible variability that exists in those genes that God put there in the original kinds and in the original people, Adam and Eve. We then discussed the fact that if you take biblical history, Noah's Ark, we have 2 dogs, for instance, come off the ark. You get that population of dogs again, but then smaller populations break off and move in different directions, taking different combinations of genes with them. Eventually, you can end up with different species or varieties selected by the environment, but that's the opposite of evolution, because you're getting information redistribution, information losing processes, but it's not information gaining processes. We're losing information, not gaining information, the opposite of evolution. There is no evidence for evolution. Evolution is a belief system applied to the evidence that real science does not support. Real science supports what the Bible says. Now, I want to take that basic understanding of genetics and apply it to all the people groups. And here's what I want you to think about. Can you think of anything at all? Can you think of anything at all in biblical history, anything at all that might cause the human population to split up and the genes to split up? Can you think of anything at all in the human history that might cause those genes to be distributed all over the earth? Can you think of anything at all? Can anyone think of anything at all? How about the Tower of Babel? You know, it's exciting being a Christian. It's exciting reading the Bible because the Bible explains all these things. Now, of course, if all human beings are descendants of Adam and Eve, and I believe it was the Tower of Babel was a major event in history because God gives different languages, you know what's going to happen? Just like those dogs splitting up, you're going to have the human population split up, not mixing with each other. You're going to get certain characteristics that will dominate particular groups. I mean, it's very simple, really. But you know the most asked question I get asked anywhere in the world? You know what it is? Where did Cain get his wife? You know why I'm asked that question? It was asked at the Scopes trial in 1925 when William Jennings Bryan was asked that question of the ACLU lawyer, Clarence Darrow. You know why he asked the question of William Jennings Bryan? He wanted to put Christianity on trial for the world. That's really what the Scopes trial was all about. And what he basically said was, you believe the Bible? Okay, defend biblical history. Where did Cain get his wife? Do you know that question has been asked time and time again since that particular event? Do you know that most Christians don't have an answer? You look on humanist websites, they mock at Christians. So where did Cain get his wife? If you can't answer that question, how do you defend? We all go back to Adam and Eve. How do you defend biblical history? It's an important question to answer. Now, if we read the scripture, it says that the first man, Adam, in 1 Corinthians 15:45. So how many men to start with according to the Bible? One, okay, one man to start with. Genesis 3:20 says this, Eve was given that name. In the Hebrew, it literally reads that she was to be the mother of all the living. So one man, one woman. Acts 17, verse 26, God made of one blood. Paul, he was explaining the gospel to the Greeks. And the Greek language actually there is saying, we all go back to one. We're all related. We all go back to one man. We're all related, which we are. That's why we take the gospel to every tribe and nation. You know, I was over in London at a restaurant, and the chef heard that we're doing a creation seminar. And he came out and he said, you believe the Bible? I said, yes, I believe the Bible. He said, I don't believe the Bible. I said, you don't believe the Bible? No. I said, why not? Well, he said, it says God made Adam and Eve and they had Cain and Abel. Where'd all the people come from then? I said, Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 says Adam had sons and daughters. He said, I didn't read that far. Well, you know, that's a problem with a lot of people. They don't read that far. So Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, which means, okay, let's get rid of all outside influences and ideas people might have given you. If we start just from the Bible, Adam and Eve had sons and daughters, which means originally brothers married who? Sisters. Now, as soon as I say that somewhere, what does somebody say? Oh, that's incest and you're not allowed to marry a relative? Wait a minute. If you don't marry a relative, you don't marry a human, then you are really in trouble. You see, we're all related, aren't we? We all go back to Adam. I mean, I'm related to you. In fact, I'm just here talking to my long-lost family I haven't met before. How you going? Good to see you all. See, we're all related. You're related to everyone in the world. We're all related to each other. Of course we are, because we go back to Adam and Eve. So when you get married, you do marry your relative, right? That's important. But today we don't marry a close relative. Now, why is that? Well, when, for the first time, did God say no longer can close relations marry? It wasn't until Leviticus 18. The first time God said no longer can close relations marry. Abraham was married to his half-sister, wasn't he? So why is it then, and that wasn't a problem, why is it that close relatives then could marry generations ago, but not today? To understand this, you have to do what I call, now you'll see, this is the climax of something I've been talking about in these sessions. Here it is. To understand this issue, you have to do what I call think poodle. See, this is what I've been leading up to all the time, okay? And that's this. Just as a poodle is full of mutations, so are we. See, here's what I want you to think about. Adam and Eve were perfect to start with, but sin entered the world. You know, because of sin, God no longer holds everything together 100%. If he did, it'd be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You couldn't even be hurt by fire. Not even the smell of smoke on them or anything like that. Right? Or the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years and their shoes didn't wear out and their feet didn't swell. Can you imagine what it'd be like if God upheld everything 100%? We wouldn't wear out, we wouldn't die. Hey, it's going to be like that in the future, isn't it? And for those who trust in him will live with him forever. But you see, right now we live in a fallen world, and so things are falling apart because God no longer holds everything together, because the penalty of death is here. We have to die because we forfeited our right to live. We told God we didn't want him in Adam. So you see, what happens is this. Adam and Eve had children, but you know what happens now? Because God no longer holds everything together, each generation there's some copying mistakes in our genes and some mutations that cause mistakes, and they get into one generation, then they're copied to the next, and then new ones in the next, and they're copied to the next, and new ones in the next, and they accumulate more and more until 6,000 years later, look at the mess. I'm just looking around at it. It is a mess. Now, see, the problem is this. If close relations married today, it's more likely you've got the same mistakes inherited from your parents, and they could get together and cause problems in the offspring. A more likelihood of an increased likelihood of deformities in the offspring because there's so many mistakes. It's more likely that close relations have the same sorts of mistakes. Now, if you think about this, okay, let's think about this in terms of biblical history. All right, we start with, and that disappeared on me, so we will just bring it back if I can. Why is it that these things always play up? And I have no idea why they play up. Okay, it's a fallen world. It's all because of sin. That's exactly right. It's all because of sin. And here we are on live television, and my computer has muffed it right now. So let me keep talking while we try and get that back for you. And that is that as you go back in history towards Adam and Eve, would you expect more mistakes or fewer mistakes? You'd expect fewer mistakes until before sin. How many mistakes? No mistakes. So could close relations marry originally? And it wasn't a problem? Not a problem if close relations married originally? Well, that wasn't a problem, was it? Brother and sister could marry and it wouldn't be a problem. But today, if close relations marry, it is a problem. And you know why it's a problem if close relations marry today? Because you've got those mistakes that you've inherited from your parents. And so we find today that there's an increased likelihood of those sorts of problems. Well, I have my computer back, so now we can go back and figure all this out. Isn't technology wonderful, built by sinful man, so that you can see what happens here? So let's have a look at this picture here. Okay, so as you go back in history towards Adam and Eve, you'd expect fewer mistakes. Before sin, no mistakes. So in close relations married originally, it wasn't a problem, provided it was one man for one woman for life, which is what marriage is all about. So you see, there's no difference between brother and sister marriage than close relatives marrying today. Or when I say close relatives, then relatives marrying today. It's just close relatives don't marry today. And so that's a very easy question to answer. Where did Cain get his wife? Now, by the way, the word incest is a modern word. You realize that? Like the word dinosaur? And the word incest encompasses a whole range of things, some of which have always been immoral, but not brother and sister marriage, because it's no different to just a man and woman getting married today. But in the context of the Bible, it makes sense, doesn't it? When you start to think about that. And a little bit of understanding of genetics and mutations and those sorts of mistakes. Well, people say, okay, so we can understand where Cain got his wife, then how do we explain all the different people groups then, going back to Adam and Eve? How do we explain the differences in skin color, eye shape, and so on? Well, first of all, let's consider a little bit of history here. When Darwin wrote his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, do you realize many people aren't aware of the rest of the title of that book, which said, "And the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life." And if you want to know what Darwin meant by that, then you go to his next book called The Descent of Man. And then he makes it very, very clear, because this picture here really does represent what Darwin taught, that there are different races of people, some closer to ape-like ancestors than others. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong here. I am not blaming evolution for racist attitudes, but can you see, for people who believe in Darwinian evolution, how that could fuel or engender racism? Can you see that? Because if some races are inferior to others, others are more superior, can't you see some could look down on others? And that's exactly what happened in history. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard University said this. He said, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. And that's exactly what happened. See, evolution is not the cause of racism. You know what the cause of racism is? I mean, evolution is not the cause of abortion. Evolution is not the cause of homosexual behavior. Ultimately, it's what? Sin, exactly. But Darwinian evolution fuels racism. And the more people are taught Darwinian evolution or taught there's no God, then you can see how they could then justify racism or justify homosexual behavior or abortion or whatever they want. And sadly, let me show you how this played out in history. Did you know that in 1924, the New York Tribune newspaper published an article, The Missing Links Found in Australia? You know who the missing links were? The Australian Aborigines. And in fact, it is a sad part of Australia's history, well documented in the secular world, that scientists from Germany and England, other places, America, sent people to Australia. They paid property owners to go on their property. They herded the Aborigines into swamps or over cliffs to kill them, men, women and children. They shot them. They had instructions on how to boil up their skulls, how to skin them for specimens for museums around the world. 5,000 to 10,000 Aboriginal graves were desecrated, all in the name of evolution. Pretty sad, isn't it? Now, let me tell you something about your own history here. Did you know in 1904, Otto Benga, pygmy from South Africa, was brought over to America for the World's Fair, and instead of taking him back to his own country, the explorer and the director of the Bronx Zoo did a deal together because of their belief in evolution, and that is well documented. In our book, One Blood, we have a whole chapter dedicated to Otto Benga. It's a very sad part of American history. In fact, there was a book written called The Pygmy in the Zoo, and we document in there that because of their evolutionary beliefs, they put Otto Benga in a cage with an orangutan called the monkey cage. It became the most popular exhibit at the Bronx Zoo, and Americans lined up in long lines on weekend to show their children the relationship between the pygmy and the orangutan. What do you think that was doing to children's thinking in America? Not only that, do you know that in colleges across America and other parts of the world, students were reading statements like this? For instance, Scientific American. You've heard of Scientific American, haven't you? You find it in newsstands. Did you know that back in 1907 they talked about the pygmies, the Congo pygmies, being ape-like elfish creatures? And then you had a book called The History of Creation, which was studied as a textbook in many universities in America. In fact, students even from church homes were studying these sorts of books. Who remembers being taught at school embryonic recapitulation, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? Do you remember that? Well, let me put it another way. How many of you remember being taught that when an embryo develops in its mother's womb, it goes through a fish stage with gill slits till it becomes human? Who remembers being taught that? Oh, okay. Who remembers seeing pictures like this in their textbook? Remember those embryo pictures? And you look at them and say, oh, look how similar they are. You know, here we have these different animals here, and we have man, and look how similar the embryos are. Did you know that those pictures are still in most public school textbooks in America and other parts of the world today? And yet the man who popularized this, called Ernst Haeckel, who wrote this book called The History of Creationism, doctored his diagram. It's a well-known fraud. A doctor in England, not that long ago, in fact, did some work, and he showed that arrow there points to Haeckel's original diagrams, and so he went and looked at the actual embryos themselves, and when you look at them, here's what they look like. The fraud, it was absolutely startling. What Haeckel did, and admitted he did, he used the same basic wood carving diagrams of the embryos because he wanted to believe in evolution. He believed it was true. And the public was sucked in. What gets me is this has been known to be a fraud for 40, 50 years or more. It's still in most public school textbooks. It's incredible. Well, Haeckel published a book called The History of Creation. Here are some of the statements from Haeckel's book. I hate to even read these to you. I'm sorry to read these to you. I'm embarrassed to read these to you. But I want you to know what people were learning in colleges and universities across America and other parts of the world. Imagine generations in America learning this. At the lowest stage of human mental development, the Australian Aborigines, Polynesians, and so on, the Negro, and it's very, very sad what they were learning there. And then we go on to some of the other statements that he has. I consider the Negro to be a lower species of man, cannot make up my mind to look upon him as a man and a brother, for the gorilla would have to be admitted into the family, according to some English traveller he quoted in that particular book. Or here we have, he has an account of a missionary, Morlang, who supposedly tried to, without success, to civilize the ape-like Negro tribes. They stand far below unreasoning animals. Can you imagine generations of students in America learning that sort of thing? Isn't that mind-blowing? Now, here's an interesting quote. I want you to look at this. Do you know where this quote comes from? It comes from the biology textbook used by John Scopes and others at the time of the Scopes trial. Now, evolutionists don't often tell you about this, but here is the textbook that was teaching evolution and so on in the public schools at that time, the very one that John Scopes purportedly used, and said this: there are 5 races or varieties of man. There's the Negro type, brown race, American Indian, Mongolian or yellow race. And then I want you to have a look at this last statement here, because this is very, very telling, this last statement here. And finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. You imagine whole generations coming through a public education system in America from the public schools, learning that those who are Americans, the Caucasians and Americans, were part of the highest race of all. What do you think that would do in regard to their views on others? Pretty sad, isn't it? You know, I'm going to challenge us here. I'm going to say this. I believe the church should get rid of the term races. You see, at the time of Thomas Jefferson, for instance, when people talked about races, by and large it was the English race, the Irish race, that sort of thing. But evolution, Darwinian evolution, has so permeated our thinking that today so many people, when you think of races, tend to think of inferior and superior races, some that are lower than others. And friends, I believe all of us even have been indoctrinated in some way in regard to that sort of teaching. People before us aren't as good as us and things like that. I think it's about time the church abandoned the term races and started to use terms like people groups or something like that. And we should be out there telling the world there is only one race anyway. We're all descendants of Adam. Remember a man who told me after listening to one of these lectures, he said, when I went home and filled out my census form, he said, when it said, what race are you? I put down Adams. And I thought to myself, can you imagine some federal government public servant looking at that census form and saying, hey, has anybody heard of this Adams race? Well, of course, a long time ago, everyone heard of Adams race, didn't they? You know the sad thing to me? The church is not leading the way in regard to the issues of racism because, just like it did with the millions of years, it also adopted the secular worldview into the Bible, and now, because it's politically incorrect to talk about some of these things the way that they have been, now the world is changing their mind and the church is left behind because it accommodated to the world in the first place. You see, that's what's happened over and over again in the church. On the ABC News Science page, in regard to some of the research that had been done on humans, they said this: more and more scientists find the differences that set us apart are cultural, not racial. Some even say the word race should be abandoned because it's meaningless. Why hasn't the church been out there saying this? Why haven't we been leading the way? But no, we're infiltrated by outside ideas. That's the problem. In fact, that's why I like the term in Acts chapter 17, God made of one blood. We're all related. We all go back to Adam and Eve. And that's why when I look at any one of you here, you know, I've tried to train myself, and you'll see as we go through this in a moment, not to look at little minor external features, but to program myself to start looking at who the real person is. Not just some external feature that some people have been taught to look at more than others, and we'll talk about that. You see, how many of you were taught, like I was taught, that there are main racial groups, like we read in that particular quote from the textbook in the Scopes trial days? You know, they're Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, Australoid. How many were taught those sorts of groupings? Do you realize, in a sense, how racist they are? I mean, have you ever thought, why do they put people into those sort of groups? Why are the Australian Aborigines out on their own, for instance? Why do they do that? Well, here's something that's very interesting. I want to go through and look at what researchers today are finding. For instance, Dr. Venter, part of the Human Genome Project, as they were putting together this draft of the human genome, you know the Human Genome Project, the entire sequence of the human genome, do you know what they found? Startling conclusion. You know what their conclusion is? There is only one race, the human race. Wow! We finally figured it out. Of course, if we'd have read the Bible, we would have known this all along. But now scientists are starting to say, so you know what the church does now? Well, I guess if the scientists are saying it now, oh boy, now we can start to believe the Bible. Wow. You know, it's sad, but that's how much of the church operates. It is sad, isn't it? It's interesting. Every human being carries about 6 billion base pairs, the chemical rungs of the DNA ladder, and the nuclei of his or her cells Did you know that our personal DNA code differs from that of a random stranger by 2 rungs for every 1,000, or about 0.2% of the whole? In other words, the difference genetically between any 2 people is about 0.2%. Now, I want you to think about that. In other words, the difference between me and one of you here is about 0.2% genetically. Here's what scientists have also found. In the field of genetics, this is from some research that scientists have been doing, researchers have concluded that the genetic differences between the so-called races, we'll come back to that a little later on, account for only 0.012% of human biological variation. That's pretty insignificant. That's only 6% of the 0.2%. That's pretty insignificant, isn't it? In other words, as the human genome people found out, they said if you ask what percentage of your genes is reflected in your external appearance, the basis by which we talk about race, do you see what they're saying? The basis by which we talk about race is external appearance. And let's be honest. Let me ask you a question. I want you to be honest with me. In America today, when it comes to issues of race and prejudice, tell me something. Would you agree with me? The major issue, if we're really honest with ourselves, the major issue is not the shape of your ear or your chin or your nose, it's how much skin color you have. Aren't I right? Pretty sad. Now, what I'm saying to you is this. If you use those classifications, Caucasoid, Negroid, and so on, I do that just for the sake of this argument here, the difference between any 2 people is about 0.2%, but the genetic differences that are used for the so-called racial characteristics, in other words, skin color, eye shape, and so on, constitute only about 0.01%. That's pretty insignificant, isn't it? You know what the human genome people said? The criteria people use for race are based entirely on external features we are, what's that word? Programmed to recognize. You know what, friends? I was shocked when I came to America. I have to tell you, I was shocked when I came to America as an Australian. See, I grew up in the church where we have Australian Aborigines in our churches, and some of the New Guinea native people, that have come to Australia and so on, and people from, the Philippines and other sort of places, and I never thought a thing about it. I come to America, and I was shocked because I found a lot of places in America, there is segregation on the basis of what people call skin color. And it still exists today, doesn't it? In a lot of places in America. I mean, that shocked me. I thought, what is going on? This nation's supposed to be the greatest Christian nation on earth. What's going on in America? It's one of the reasons why I had a real burden to get that book out, One Blood, and to talk on this particular topic. Because I would like to suggest to you that in this country, as well as other countries, there's racist attitudes for all sorts of reasons, but I think in this country, one of the greatest characteristics used for racism is skin color. And notice what the human genome people said, we're programmed to recognize. I suggest to you generations of children who are brought up even in church homes, programmed to look at skin color. That if you weren't brought up that way, you wouldn't see the differences as many people see them. See, think about this. I mean, do you belong to a church where when people walk in, you say, uh-oh, they're the little earlobe people. Little earlobe people aren't allowed in this church. They've got to go down the road. This is only the big earlobe people church. We should segregate on earlobes. We don't do that. Why not? What's the difference between big earlobes, little earlobes, and the shape of your eye and how much skin color you have? They're all just surface differences that are very minor. But you see, we've been programmed to select certain characteristics. And it engenders racism and prejudice. But people say to me, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Look at all those people. Look how different they are. Look at the different colors. Excuse me? Actually, I don't see much difference at all. Why not? See, people say to me, but you're a white person. I'm not white. Look, there I am pictured with a white background. If I looked white, I'd be dead. And somebody says, well, there's a black person. Actually, they're not black. Did you know there are no black people and no white people? See, we all have a pigment called melanin. Melanin is a brown pigment. There's actually a couple of forms of melanin. Actually, if you're a redhead, my mother's a redhead. If you're a redhead, you have one of those forms that really is missing, and that creates a problem because you can get skin cancer because of ultraviolet radiation and so on. And so, I mean, redheads are like poodles, well, anyway, I can say that. My mother's a redhead, all right. But you know what I'm saying. But you see, actually, my mother has skin cancers cut out almost every year, even if she doesn't go out in the sun. because she needs that pigment that she really doesn't have, okay? But you have a pigment called melanin. In other words, it's there for a very important reason. It's sort of a complicated factor. You know, the melanin is formed as little umbrella over your dividing cells, and it's how much is broken down and so on. But again, let's look at just basic principles. Probably 6 genes or more for the amount of melanin in your skin. But if you have big A, big B, it means lots of melanin, little a, little b, a little bit of melanin. So if you had all big A's, big B's, you could be dark, little a's, little b's light, a mixture, you'd be in the middle. By the way, what do you think Adam and Eve most likely were? In the middle genetically, right? Middle brown. You see, if they were what we call Caucasian white today, then all their children would be little a's, little b's, right? That'd be a boring world, wouldn't it? We'd all look the same. But if they were all big A's, big B's, they'd all be black, or what you call black, which is not really black, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But if they were a mixture, if they were in the middle brown, the majority of the world's population are middle brown, by the way, then you realize their children could have been light through to dark in one generation. Lots of families like that. In fact, they're exciting families. What's the next one going to be like? They really are exciting families. By the way, there were twins born in England a number of years ago, one dark, one light, and some people actually did not believe that they could have the same parents and so on, and there's a lot of prejudice involved, as from what I've read in the newspapers. But you see, if you understand some basic genetics, you can understand how that could happen. I was at one seminar, a guy came up to me and said, "Were they identical twins?" Anyway, let's go on here. So then people say to me, okay, but how come some people only produce dark-skinned people, some only produce light-skinned people? By the way, I hope you understand something. When people say, what colour skin are you? That's the wrong question. It's what shade of skin are you? Because we all have the same colour. It's a brown pigment. You can have light brown, dark brown, you can be in the middle. So, you know, when people say to me, well, there's a coloured person, I'm a coloured person. That's true. See, we all have the same basic colour. It's just a matter of how much or how little of that colour you have. Then people say, why is it some people only produce dark people, some people only produce light people? Well, think of the event of the Tower of Babel once again, okay? Now, again, just doing basic principles, all right? If you start with big A, big B, little b, Adam and Eve being middle brown, mixture like that, here are all the possible combinations. Now, think about this. If, for whatever reason, because of the Tower of Babel, certain people ended up in a certain area with only big A's and big B's, all the others died out of the population, you know, like the long-haired dog example and the short-haired dog example? Well, if you've only got big A's and big B's, you're only going to produce what? Dark-skinned people. Imagine some others go to a different climate somewhere, and imagine, for instance, in Queensland, the highest rate of skin cancer in the world, where I come from. Well, you can imagine, before the days of all the skin lotions and understanding more about skin cancer and so on, those with dark skin in that environment would survive better than light skin, and maybe the opposite in some other environment. You see what can happen? Just like with dogs, right? And so you could end up with a group of people only with little A's and little B's that only produce light-skinned people. The big A's and big B's would have to mix with the little A's and little B's to get back all that genetic variability that was separated out because of the Tower of Babel. Very easy to understand. Hey, you could even theoretically, in a sense, get things like this. You imagine that some group of people had to run from another group who continually warred upon them or something like that, and had to run from wild animals. Maybe the selection process there would be those with the genes for the best athletic ability survive better than others. Maybe they today give some of the world's best athletes. And the same could happen even with intelligence or any other characteristic. Just because somebody might be more intelligent than others, or somebody might be a better athlete than others, or do something else better than others, doesn't mean you look down on them in any way whatsoever. If you have the biblical worldview, we're all equal before God, and all go back to Adam. Trouble is, some people look down on others because there might be some differences or whatever. You know, we've inherited all these genes going back to Adam and Eve. It's very important to understand we're all of one blood. Even when it comes to eye shape, it's not a matter of different eyes. You have the same eye. Just you have genes for the amount of melanin. You have genes for the amount of fat in your eyelid that might give it the almond shape. And again, a sorting out process because of the Tower of Babel, but they're really the same eyes. As one researcher said, a man called Day, he said, it's kind of like all of us are recipes. We have the same ingredients, maybe in different amounts, no matter what kind of cake we turn out to be. And you know what? I sort of like to picture this for you because I like to picture things in diagrams. How does the average American bake a cake these days? Well, you buy a box and mix it up with water. But you imagine baking a cake, and you can make a number of different cakes, slight variations, but the same basic recipe. Well, in a sense, Adam and Eve start out with the same basic original DNA recipe. We're all the same basic recipe, we just have very slight variations. Wow, what a difference it makes when you understand things correctly. But let me ask you all a question. Put your hands up if you've heard of, doesn't mean you believe it or anything, but you've heard of the so-called curse of Ham. You know what? I'm very sensitive to that. My name is Ham, and so I'm very, very sensitive to that. But hey, you know something? When I ask these questions, and then the next one I'm going to ask as well, the biggest response I get to these questions is in America, compared to any other country in the world. It's interesting. Let me ask you another question. Let's be honest. Just be up front, okay? Australians are pretty blood tell like it. You ever seen that guy on TV, that crocodile hunter? 17 million of us over there. I want you to understand that. I think he's nuts anyway, but don't worry about that. But, okay, put your hand up if you've heard of the curse of Ham related to skin color, particularly dark skin. Okay, hands down. I get that response in America, a much bigger response in America to those questions than any other country that I've ever been to. Something has happened in the church in America. So let's just deal with this, okay? Let me just give you a couple of interesting quotes here. Did you know the Mormons, back in 1958, said this? We know the circumstances under which the posterity of Cain and later of Ham were cursed with what we call Negroid racial characteristics. How is that for a racist statement? Did you know that Jehovah's Witnesses, back in 1929, taught this? The curse which Noah pronounced upon Canaan was the origin of the black race. How's that for a racist statement? By the way, they did get one thing right. You know what they got right? The curse which Noah pronounced upon Canaan. See, let's have a look at this. You know what the Bible says? Genesis 9, Ham the father of Canaan, Ham the father of Canaan, and then cursed be Canaan. Not Ham. Okay, there is no curse of Ham. No such thing. How come the church has all heard this? Where's the curse of Ham? It's not in the Bible. How come we go around hearing this stuff? And then I've often wondered, why does the Bible single out? It doesn't single out Shem or Japheth, but Ham, the father of Canaan. Ham, the father of Canaan. You know what hit me? You see, Canaan was youngest son of Ham. And if you look at the descendants of Canaan, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Canaanites, some of those wicked people that ever lived on earth, judged for sexual immorality and so on. You know what hit me? Ham was disrespectful to his father, Noah, in some way. And you know, when you often see sin in one generation, if it's not dealt with, the Bible makes it clear, you often see it in the next to a greater or lesser extent. Greater extent. And Canaan being a youngest son anyway, you know what happens? I mean, you know, if you have a number of children, by the time you get to number 5, it's, oh man, another sinful creature to bring up for the Lord. And you're getting tired, and people often say, you know, the younger ones tend to be more spoiled, you don't apply the same standards. Isn't that easy for that to happen, isn't it? And you know what I believe the curse of Canaan was all about? I think it's nothing more, or it's very, very important. It's nothing to do with skin color, nothing to do with that sort of thing. That's absurd nonsense. It's to do with the fact that I believe that Noah saw in Canaan, maybe obviously inspired by the Lord, but the same problem in Ham was in Canaan to a greater extent, and it was a prophecy concerning what would happen if you bring up a Canaan, if you don't deal with sin, if you don't train children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It has nothing to do with skin color, but everything to do with fathers, train your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That's what it's all about. Well, as one researcher said on the science page of the ABC, what the facts show is there are differences among us, but they stem from culture, not race. Hey, what a difference it would make if we started in our churches building our thinking on the Bible instead of adding man's ideas into the Bible. You know what happens though? Because of the millions of years, we're so used to adding millions of years into the Bible, it's easy to take other views of man and add them into the Bible, and even secular counseling methods and all sorts of things that we add into the Bible. What a difference if we started building our thinking on the Bible and teaching people biblical history. We're all equal before God. We all go back to Noah, back to Adam. We all have the same problem, sin. We all need the same solution, Jesus Christ. And every one of us, no matter who we are, what culture we're from, should judge our attitudes and behaviors and beliefs against the absolute authority of the Word of God. If we started teaching that in our churches and our culture, we could begin to deal with the issue of racism tomorrow like that. What a difference that'd make. Let me deal with a couple of other things here before we wind all this up, and that is this. If you believe in millions of years, like Hugh Ross from California, for instance, if you believe the secular dating methods work, you have a problem. You know what the problem is? Remember all those begats? See, you know, if you take a strict genealogy, strict chronology of the Bible, you can only get about 6,000 years. And you can't put too many other years in those genealogies or it would destroy them. In fact, I don't believe in putting any extra in them, to be honest. I mean, Enoch says Jude was the seventh from Adam. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Man, that's a surprise. He believed those genealogies. Of course he did. What are you going to do if you believe in the secular dating methods? Because you know the problem you've got? Well, there are human skeletons. See all these? Did you get all those? Did you get all those? See those? There are human skeletons dated by these dating methods that these skeletons show evidence that they killed each other with axes or they did cave paintings, buried their dead, religious practices, and they date all the way back to about 2 million years. What are you going to do with them? You can't fit them in those bagats. Do you know what people like Hugh Ross does? Do you know how people who compromise the Word of God with millions of years try to get around it? Here's what he said on his website. Starting 2 to 4 million years ago, God began creating man like mammals or hominids. These creatures stood on 2 feet, had large brains, used tools, some even buried their dead, painted on cave walls. However, they were very different from us. They had no spirit. They did not have a conscience like we do. They did not worship God or establish religious practices. In time, all these man-like creatures went extinct, and 10 to 25,000 years ago, God replaced them with Adam and Eve. This is what is being taught in the world today in certain places in the church. I mean, Hugh Ross is the leader of the progressive creation movement. He believes in billions of years and Big Bang and has influenced many of our Christian colleges. You know, we confronted him on our website because we showed something to people. Said, you know, it's interesting. The same sorts of dating methods date the Australian Aborigines back 40, 60,000 years and the American Indians as well. So if you take Hugh Ross's statement, then they're not descendants of Adam and Eve, so we shouldn't send missionaries to them. Because only descendants of Adam and Eve can be saved. You know, it wasn't until just recently that Hugh Ross then changed the quote on his website. It now reads this. So 10 to 60,000 years ago, God replaced them with Adam and Eve. By the way, some people are trying to push the Australian Aborigines back 100,000 years. He'll have to change his quote again. You know the interesting thing? You know at the time of the Scopes trial in 1925, many people don't know this, but the humanist lawyer Clarence Darrow managed to get many of the leading scientists of the day to put into the transcript of the Scopes trial the major evidences for evolution, pages and pages of the evidences for evolution. And he had some of the leading church people in America, theologians representing the church, put their testimony in the transcript of the Scopes trial. You know what it was? You got to trust the scientists. They got all this evidence for evolution. When we come to the present, looking back to the Scopes trial over 75 years ago, you know what we now know? Nearly all the evidence for evolution that was given as fact has been thrown out, and evolutionists no longer believe it. Things like Piltdown Man that was shown to be a fraud and so on. You know what I say to people? You know, it's interesting. The Scopes trial scientists, those scientists in those days, they're dead. Their theories have been thrown out. The theologians that agreed with them and told the church to agree with them, they're dead. Their ideas have been thrown out. God is not dead, His word has not changed, and He is alive forevermore. So we need to put our trust in the authority of the Word of God, not the ever-changing theories of fallible man. Well, I want to deal with one last issue. Usually I do this as a final session in a seminar, and then I go and catch a plane and leave. Because this is a pretty emotional issue. Because people say to me, okay, then, what do you believe about interracial marriage? By the way, if you disagree with what I'm about to say, and you come up and talk to me, please don't give me your opinions, because I'm not interested. But if you want to come and argue from the Bible, I'll answer the question. Now, people say to me, okay, well, what do you believe about interracial marriage? Okay, now I'm going to make a statement, but do not jump to conclusions until I finish my statement. Does the Bible talk about interracial marriage? Absolutely it does. In fact, all the way through the Bible. And the Bible is totally against it. It says the saved race should never knowingly marry the unsaved race, and that is all the Bible says about interracial marriage. Let me just deal with this in a little more detail because it pertains to everything else we've done in this session and sort of brings it to a nice climax, I believe. See, first of all, when people do ask me about interracial marriage, I say, to be honest, there's no such thing because there's only one race anyway. So really, we're talking about inter-people group marriage or something like that. And then, if you're going to talk about marriage, well, the first thing you have to do is understand what marriage is all about. Do you know there's one interesting passage in the Bible, in Malachi 2, where the prophet asks the question, why did God make two one? And you know the answer? Because he sought godly seed. Do you realize the family is the first and most fundamental of all human institutions which God ordained in Scripture? Do you realize the family is the educational unit of the nation? By the way, the state was never given right to educate our children. It was given to the family, particularly the father as the spiritual head of the house. And most fathers haven't taken on their spiritual headship, by the way. But you see, do you realize the family, you are to produce godly offspring who influence the world for Jesus Christ, to produce godly offspring who influence the world for Jesus Christ, to produce godly offspring who influence the world for Jesus Christ, generation after generation after generation. You know what Satan wants to do? He wants to destroy that. And he has done so with the Israelites ever since their beginning. And he's doing so with the church today. You see, how are we going to produce godly offspring? Well, you know, Paul in Ephesians 5 and Jesus in Matthew 19 talks about the fact that when you're married, you're to be one spiritually, and you become one physically because you're one flesh. What does it mean, one spiritually? Well, 2 Corinthians 6:14 is a principle we can apply across the board, and we apply to marriage. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? And that's not talking about light and dark skin. That's talking about spiritual light and spiritual darkness, by the way. You know one of the sad things? I find in America more parents worried about their children not marrying someone they think is from a different physical, so-called physical race than whether or not they're of the same spiritual race. And it really blows my mind that I visit families and they say, oh, my daughter's dating, isn't that great? Well, is Bill a Christian? What's that got to do with it? Everything if you understand marriage. And I can't believe the number of Christian young people that date non-Christians, and they even use excuses like, well, I'm taking them to church and I hope they'll become a Christian. Is that what the Bible says marriage is all about? And by the way, in some exceptional circumstances, they might become a Christian. Praise the Lord if they do. That does not negate the fact that a Christian should never knowingly marry a non-Christian. Now, if you're married and you're not Christians and someone becomes a Christian, the Bible tells you the principles you're to operate by to save that marriage and to witness to the other partner and to be a loving support to the other partner. But you see, I think a lot of people have because we've incorporated the world's view in regard to races and so on, we've lost what the Bible teaches in regard to this matter. So let me ask you a question. Which impending marriage here does God clearly counsel against? This one, Christian and Christian, clearly counsel against, remember? This one or this one? You know what the answer is? It's the non-Christian and the Christian. It's the last one, isn't it? See, as I say to people, the real biblical interracial marriage is when a child of the last Adam marries a child of the first Adam. In other words, biological fact. All humans belong to one race. Spiritual fact. All humans are divided into two races. What is the difference between the two spiritual races? The difference in which or the direction in which they are racing. The broad way and the narrow way. By the way, if you came to me for marriage counseling, and I wouldn't encourage that, but if you did, and you were from two totally different cultures, you know what I'd say? Caution, when you're from different cultures, you think differently, you might not communicate well. A lot of marriages have had problems because of that, and so you need to be aware of that. But bottom line, if you're a man and a woman who love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and you want to get married, there's no biblical principle that says you can't. By the way, remember Rahab? Rahab was a Canaanite, presumably a descendant of Ham, in a Canaanite city who married an Israelite, and she's in the genealogy leading to Jesus. Wow! Does the Bible say anything against that? No. You know why? She stopped being a Canaanite spiritually, became an Israelite spiritually, then she's of the same race, which is what the Bible talks about. The doctrine of Balaam. You know what Balaam said? Get the Israelites to marry the pagans. That's how to destroy them. And that's what's happened with the Israelites over and over again. They married pagans and destroyed the family. You know, as I say to people, when people come into our church, and I'm going to ask Buddy to sing a song here in a moment to finish this off, let's look past the genetics. Let's look at the real person. Let's look past the external features and be like God, like Samuel when he went to anoint the king. And he said, oh, this son of Jesse will be the king. You know what God said? No, because God doesn't look on the outward appearance. He looks on the heart. And friends, we've got to start looking on the inside instead of majoring on looking on the outside at small differences. By the way, all this is in our book and video, One Blood. It's also in the book, the Answers book, summarized. It's in a great little witnessing tool called the 4 Big Questions. We even have some little booklets that cover all these sorts of things you can use as witnessing tools. And you'll notice too that in our books like Dinosaurs of Eden, A is for Adam and so on, we actually make sure that Adam looks to be middle brown and things like that. And we also have this in our video series and teaching in our magazine. I'm going to ask Buddy if he'll sing a song to finish off with here, and I'd like you all to sing the chorus because I think it's a great witnessing song as well. We're one blood. So Buddy, let's take it away.
This is what I wish. I wish the world had blinders on so nobody could see. The things that make us different are so minor, so petty. And there's major things that unite us and make us all the same, like the blood that's flowing deep inside our veins. We're one blood, we're one people. You can trace our family tree all the way through history, back to Adam, back to Eve. We're one blood, we're created in the image of our God, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood. Every language is the same. When we laugh or cry, let's look past our shade of skin. Let's retrain the eye. God created everyone, man, woman, boy, and girl. And we're just one big family in this tiny world. We're one blood, we're one people. You can trace our family tree all the way through history, back to Adam, back to Eve. We're one blood, we're created in the image of our God, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood. By his blood, we're his people. The cross became our family tree. Jesus came to set us free. The last Adam died for me. We're one blood, we're created in the image of our God, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood, we're one blood, we're one people. You can trace our family tree all the way through history, back to Adam, back to Eve. We're one blood, we're created in the image of our God, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood. Everyone, here we go. We're one blood, we're one people. You can trace our family tree all the way through history, back to Adam, back to Eve. We're one blood, we're created in the image of our God, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood, made to worship, made to love. We're one blood.
One blood, God's answer to racism. Ken Ham, our teacher, on this day of creationism from the Thomas Road Baptist Church, Lynchburg, Virginia, live on the Liberty Channel. Let me talk with you now about studying the Bible at home, and then we'll return at the top of the hour. At the top of the hour, we'll hear Ken Ham talking about why won't they listen? The importance of creation evangelism.